Hello and good morning to you all. Welcome to this episode 1 of our Optimising Power Work series of online talks. My name is Paul Tighe. I'm a senior engineer with the Office of Public Works working on the Optimising Power Work programme, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this morning and to chair the first episode of the series. We've designed this series of talks to try and maintain engagement with our energy teams in these unprecedented times, and to try and enliven key energy issues and keep them on the agenda for our Optimising Power Work energy teams. So whether you're back at work at the moment or still working from home, we hope you find the series useful and a good way of discovering more about how the Optimising Power Work programme can support you and your energy teams. We've 6 episodes in total in this series, running for the next 3 weeks on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 11 AM. And we'll be visiting subjects such as navigating and accessing the resources of the Optimising Power Work portal, developing and running interactive energy campaigns in your workplace, monitoring and measuring energy in the home and at work, an on-location look at a green energy photovoltaic installation, and optimising heating controls at home and in the workplace. In a few moments, I'll be handing over to Evan Weatherup to present the first episode, which is entitled Optimising Power at Work in the Context of a Global Carbon Budget, COVID-19, and our progress on targets to date. But before I do, there's a couple of housekeeping issues I need to address. The first is to let you know that these sessions will be recorded, and on completion, the talks will be uploaded onto the Optimising Power Work Internet portal. We'd ask you, if you would please, that during the presentation to keep your microphones on mute and to switch off your video stream. When the presentation is finished, of course, feel free to re-engage the video and disengage your mic or put your microphones on if you want to speak or ask questions. If there's a couple of ways of raising questions, if you have questions, and we hope you do. The first would be at the end of the session to raise your hand, the hand on the toolbar on your Microsoft Teams toolbar there, and I'll take questions in turn then. Alternatively, if you want to raise a question during the presentation, you can use the text bubble on the toolbar. That'll open a text dialog box at the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and you can type your question there. Okay, I think that's all I have to say, except to say thank you very much to our consultant teams for producing this series and to you for registering to attend. I hope you find value from it, and I'm going to hand off to Evan now to deliver the first episode. Evan.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. And with the title screen, hopefully you're all familiar with the title and you're all at the right webinar. Okay, without further ado, let's get started. As the title suggests, this webinar has quite a broad and wide-ranging scope, but I've refined into 4 segments as shown. I will say before we start that the first 3 topics here would make a good postgraduate study, and at least one of them would make a nice doctoral study for someone. Hopefully I can give you a flavour of each, and believe me, there's lots more information on the net if you want to delve any deeper. So firstly, the global carbon budget. Let's be traditional and start with number 1. The term carbon budget has been in the news a lot recently as a new programme of government agreed last week dealt in carbon budgets and the well-discussed 7% reduction in annual targets. But what is it all about? We thought it was important to discuss the carbon budget, as ultimately, amongst all the benefits of the programme, the one that is the most important is a reduction in carbon emissions. We want to put these savings in a scientific context. Now, many of you will know an awful lot about the carbon budget, but just to ensure that we're all aware of the term, here's a short animation as an introduction. So hopefully this will play for you. Just give it a second to connect.
Burning fossil fuels like coal and oil releases greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. These gases are building up in our atmosphere. If the total carbon dioxide in the atmosphere exceeds a certain threshold, then global average temperatures will increase to dangerous levels. This threshold is known as the carbon budget. Since 1870, we have emitted so much carbon dioxide that we have already used up over 2/3 of our carbon budget. If we carry on releasing carbon dioxide at current rates, we will use up the remaining carbon budget in the 2030s. Cutting carbon emissions will slow down the rate at which we are approaching the carbon budget threshold. However, until we reduce our emissions to zero, carbon dioxide will still accumulate in the atmosphere, and we will hit the carbon budget threshold at some point. Even if the world takes drastic action to cut emissions, there is still a significant risk we will overshoot the carbon budget, and we will need to actively remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This can be done in part by natural solutions like planting more forests, and also through innovative negative emissions technologies. However, these technologies are unproven at scale and come with environmental implications. Relying on them is risky, and they're currently an expensive option. That's why we must step up the pace of action and accelerate the transition to a zero-carbon future. Join us in the move to a cleaner, greener, fairer future.
Okay, so hopefully that all made sense and the sound is audible. Thanks to the Graham Institute for sharing that. The next element that I'm going to introduce aims to illustrate what all this means in real time. I'd like to introduce the online resource dealing directly with the carbon budget, the climate clock. Showing on screen, the bottom line is ever increasing carbon emissions. The top line is the corresponding increase in global average temperatures, again rising steadily. The middle line is the countdown clock to when 1.5 degrees warming will be hit. I've included in this as I think it's a good visualization of the relationship between the two, all the factors, the emissions and the temperature rise. And it graphically illustrates the countdown to the carbon budget as discussed previously. What's important to remember from this is that the only actions of humanity can lower the emissions, push back the clock, and slow the corresponding warming. Thankfully, we can all play our part in that. Just before I move on, I'll just speak about the clock update history. The clock is based on current best available science and is updated each year, as you can see on screen. So you can see the revisions are a snapshot of how we're doing in relation to 1.5 and 2 degrees. Have we gained or lost times? Worryingly, most of the revisions have resulted in less time to target, giving us less time to act, as emissions have continued to rise. Our next animation comes from a great resource, the Carbon Brief website. It shows emissions over time. So it's just illustrating the global emissions peak in the past. They peaked at 3%. A 3% annual fall would have been enough to stay at 1.5 degrees, shown here on the screen. Instead, our emissions have gone the other way and increased steadily from those dates, and the pathway gets steeper and steeper as time goes by and emissions continue to increase. And as you can see, when it comes to 2018, which is the last year this is covered, the emissions are basically vertical. So the point is, the science is telling us the sooner we act, the easier the resolution. You'll see there's the future now, and it's projecting where, if the emissions level off, where we need to be. So again, the point being needs to be, the sooner we act, the better the outcome for the world. Okay, so you're looking at a cumulative pathway there through 2019 all the way up, and basically they end up as vertical lines, so we've go down to zero emissions very, very quickly. Okay, so that's the first section dealt with, which is our global carbon budget. The next strand is very topical and hopefully interesting. The impact of COVID-19 on both energy and the global emissions, and also talk a little bit the energy impact in Ireland. So we all lived through it, but what does it mean for emissions? I'd say we're all familiar with the screens like shown here, showing the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown, and a big drop in emissions, in this case nitrogen dioxide. Nitrogen dioxide is classically associated with transport emissions and burning coal, and responsible for a lot of negative health outcomes. Change in pollution from last year to this year is very stark. We're back to the carbon brief for the next animation, which again features the carbon dioxide emissions over time and highlights the downturn seen from the pandemic. So carbon emissions were expected to continue to go up, but due to the pandemic and the lockdown really in response to the pandemic, it's caused the largest ever fall in global emissions. Same there, that little downturn. But the sort of sobering thought is that even larger annual cuts will be needed every year to stay within the 1.5 degree budget. So it makes you wonder how we reach those emission cuts if everyone not leaving the house doesn't suffice. But it just illustrates the scale of what needs to happen and the actions of the same attitude of the climate emergency as the COVID crisis needs to be progressed. Okay, so this graph compares what the lockdown has meant for emissions and references other global interrupting events. As you can see, the drop in the emissions are unprecedented. The blue bars at the lower half of the screen show compared to other events like the Second World War and the financial crisis that happened just there, 2009, 2010. As you can see from the top bar, the estimates are about 6% of global carbon dioxide emissions. But this was actually done quite early, and I think the emissions estimates are being revised up as the lockdowns are going on longer than expected. And I'd say the actual total drop will be longer whenever looked at it in the past. I've seen some studies that are suggesting daily emissions decreased by 17% during the peak of the confinement in early April compared to daily levels in the year before. If this study was correct, it would mean emissions have dropped to levels not seen since 2006, but the estimates do vary, so we'll probably not know definitively yet. Again, the big drop off has only seen emissions go back to where we were in 2006, so there's still a lot of work to do. What's coming up next is a nice sequence of global CO2 emissions from the start of the year to May 20th. The impacts are actually color coded, so the brighter the blue, the higher the reduction. With the bar, you'll see floating off South America, which shows the overall global level. Just watch how the emissions follow the spread of the virus across China, into Europe, and into the Americas. Just keep an eye on that bar on the left that's sliding up and down with the emissions. So China goes into full lockdown and emissions fall, travels into Europe and into the rest of the world, and the Americas get involved in. And then as China comes out of lockdown, the emission falls decrease until May 20th, when the emissions have returned to about 6% below normal levels. So it's quite a nice illustration of the response to the pandemic, showing reduction in carbon emissions around the world. The next slide is just a run through of the flight movements over Europe in over a 90-minute period on a typical morning compared to last year. And you can see the difference is incredible. A great extent of the reductions seen have actually been around personal mobility, because people just haven't been able to get around. So the fossil fuel emissions with transport have been dramatically reduced. Some are saying 25%. So that's global, but what about Ireland? Well, the headline figure is that carbon emissions could fall up by 12% in 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. On top of that, we're expecting to see a 25% drop in transport, but obviously it's an early estimate. So let's start with everyone thinks about when we think about energy, electricity. Okay, we'll start with some recent analysis by the SEIA. You might have seen this report released last week. The orange line is the 2020 figures to date, and the blue line is 2019 for the first half of the year. So these are electricity daily demands. And it shows averaged over 7-day weekly demand this year against last year, and there's a noticeable drop whenever the lockdown started around work week 13. Average daily demand saw a 12% reduction on pre-restriction levels and stayed lower since, but the next slide will suggest that we're pretty much back to seasonal levels. One of the interesting things to note is that before the lockdown, consumptions were running higher than last year and actually at record levels. Now, The figures stated here, 21% reduction, are much higher than the original estimates. And again, I think this is because the original estimates were done when the lockdown was expected to last maybe 12 weeks to maximum. We've gone on for a lot longer. Okay, the one thing that's not mentioned in this graph is carbon intensity, which is the carbon produced per kilowatt hour of energy. Not to get too technical, but you can actually check the carbon intensity of the electricity produced in Ireland along with the energy mix in a pretty much real-time dashboard on the grid website, on the EirGrid website. So it's worth looking at. It's interesting. The carbon intensity of electricity will go up and down as different elements are put on the mix, on the energy mix. Like if fossil fuels have to kick in more because the renewables aren't in play, for if the wind isn't blowing, then the fossil fuels kick in and the energy and the carbon intensity actually will increase. So it's actually interesting at the start of the lockdown there was actually a problem with the interconnector to the UK, and the carbon intensity increased as local fossil fuels stepped in to pick up the slack. So actually, even though the emissions remained the same, even though demand dropped. So with electricity, you always have to factor in what's providing the electricity. Okay, so just another electrical trend graph. This time, average weeklies from 2008. The red line shows the current this year, and you can see again it was peaking through at the start of the year above all other years. And you just make out that this is from last week, Last week, the emissions are about level where they were last year, so kind of returned to normal levels. Turning to gas, for some unexplicit reason, in the same report, the SEI have used the different colours. So please note that in this case, the blue is 2020 and the orange is last year. But you can see that the reduction in gas is approximately about 15%. And also to note that the figures aren't heating degree corrected, so there's no allowance for the outside weather. I've just added in the heating degree days as a small inset there, and you can see, as always, gas, it very closely follows the heating degree days. So if it's colder outside, the gas consumption increases. Actually, looking at the 2020, the first period of the year was actually slightly colder than 2019, with February and March noticeably colder. So you can see that reflected in the figures, but after the lockdown comes down, the numbers fall away. Okay, so just another set of graphs from the excise people. They actually measure the CSO release figures for fuel consumption and sales, and the last months are April being released. And you can see that auto diesel is down 55% and petrol is down a massive 72%. Now, obviously, the slight difference probably reflects the fact that auto diesel is used in heavy goods vehicles, so they were continuing to run through lockdown. But unleaded petrol is very much associated with personal mobility, and it just shows how little driving by cars there was done in that period. The kerosene and the NGO, which is the right-hand two bars here, they actually show an increase, interesting enough, and the thoughts around that is that there might have been some panic buying, the so-called toilet roll effect. We'll remember everyone running out for toilet roll, but there might have been a similar idea in home heating oil when people thought there might be an interruption to supply. But also, it has to be said, there would be people taking advantage of a very low price for heating oil due to a slump in world crude oil prices. So interesting that the kerosene went up while everything else went down. Another type of kerosene is jet fuel kerosene, and there's been a dramatic drop off in air travel shown earlier in that animation we had over Europe. Previously, years showed a classic increase in flights as we all head off in our holidays, but not this year. Compared to 2019, deliveries for March and April were 27% and 84% lower respectively, and this would be considered or expected to continue into May and June, but the figures aren't released yet. But there's been very few flights in the Dublin airport until now. I think Ryanair is just starting up again this week, so those numbers will start climbing again. So that's the national level. Finally, just to put it in some context of buildings within the campaign, this graph shows energy savings for electricity and fuel for the lockdown period compared to 2019. Now, this is the cumulative figure for all the buildings in one particular department. As you can see, it's electricity where the big savings have been seen, but maybe not to the extent you might think. There's always base loads in buildings, and a lot of the weekly profiles have seen a flattening of consumption, so that weekdays and weekends are actually much closer aligned. So you wouldn't see a big difference between Monday and Sunday, which previously obviously you would have. The fuel reduction is much less, and it refers to heating. It's much less pronounced. But again, this is because fuel consumption is tied with outside temperature. Also, the lockdown corresponded with a time that the heating was ramping down in spring. And although a lot of the buildings were not fully staffed, they were still open. So it wasn't a case of just turning off the heating and letting the people still in their freeze. So the reductions haven't been as stark in fuel for sure. But overall, it's about 14% there total. Just to quickly show those in absolute figures, the cumulative kilowatt hour consumption is on the y-axis, and you can see it's dropped. Electricity dropped from about 500,000 to just over 400,000 kilowatts, so it is considerable. And fuel, as discussed, is less of a fall. So there's definitely been an impact, but again, I have to say a lot of people might think it's more dramatic than you might expect. Finally, for this section, I just came this interesting piece of research that was traveling net for COVID impacts, which I thought you may not have considered, not share. The graphs show the results of what's known as the Elderman Trust Barometer, which is an ongoing survey conducted across 11 countries with over 13,000 respondents. As a result of the crisis, public trust in the government has risen 11 percentage points, and that's the top left graph there you see, since the start of the year and it's now become the most trusted pillar of society of the four that are listed. This is the first time this has ever happened since the poll started in 2012, and the levels of trust for the government haven't been seen since the end of the Second World War. So it just shows an unlike a good emergency for people to appreciate the state institutions. The overall trust index has gained 6 points since January, which is unprecedented, and moved from neutral in grey on the bottom line to blue as trusted. Again, you can see the government is the big winners from 54% to 61% in just 5 months. Okay, so section 3 is progress to targets, and the graph shown here is produced by the Environmental Protection Agency, who actually report for our carbon dioxide emissions to the European Union. Again, figures are for 2018 with projections up to 2020. So there's no allowance for COVID in these figures. Nationally, I think it's been widely flagged that we're failed to decouple our emissions from economic growth, and we're going to miss our EU carbon emission targets by some way. And I don't think even COVID can save us in this case. At the moment, it's not clear what the exceeding these targets will mean, but there will be financial penalties. Huge figures have been put in the past for possible fines, but a recent Dutch settlement of carbon credits would suggest the cost may be lower than widely anticipated. I guess we'll find out soon enough. The other European EU national targets are around the use of renewable energy in the energy mix. This is a very pretty graphic from SEI illustrating some poor results. Again, note the data is from 2018, as this is the last report produced. At that time, Ireland had the second lowest progress to meeting the overall renewable energy service targets of 11%. That's of all EU member states. Just to note that only the top two, the overall RES targets and the transport, are actually mandated by the European Union. The other two are Irish government targets brought in to help achieve the overall target. Almost all the renewable energy you see there is from biofuels, as added to diesel and petrol at the current rate of 8.7%. There's 1% of renewable energy, renewable transport energy is from electricity, mostly transport like Dart and Lewis, but the electricity for cars is growing. It's actually Ireland's poor performance in renewable heat with only half the target met, which is our biggest reason for failing to achieve our overall energy targets. That renewable heat is wood chip boilers and heat pumps, and as you know, we're mostly still using gas and oil, so it's a lot lower than it should be. The electricity target is the only one that's still in play. With a very windy start to the year and the reduction in demand with COVID, it could be touch and go if it reaches targets. The 40% is a possibility. And you can expect to hear from EirGrid and the Irish Wind Association if we do make that target. Okay, so just bringing it home again, a little bit of the Optimising Power Work figures. Most recent figures suggest that these are figures from the campaign kicked off in 2008. Carbon savings, you'll see, are slightly higher than energy savings due to the mix of heat and electricity. I think you have to agree they're impressive figures. So credits to everyone out there for playing their part in making those savings happen. The campaign was later expanded to include public sector institutions. We're broken down for the public sector, and you see we've seen similar great progress since then. And just to be clear, those carbon savings are in absolute terms of kilowatt consumed compared to the base year, and not through the prism of energy performance indicators and energy efficiency, which is often reported. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So again, well done, and keep doing all you can to increase the savings, decrease emissions, and push back that clock. Okay, so just briefly looking ahead to the 2030 targets. They've been laid out in the European directive in 2008 and agreed by all member states. Ireland is listed here, and actually the original proposal was for 39% greenhouse gas emissions for Ireland based on GDP per capita for the period 2021 to 2030. But the target was adjusted downward for cost effectiveness by 9% to give an over headline target of 30%. So I guess it could be there, but it's all sat there sitting in the statutes. Talk a little bit about the 2030 public sector targets now. In the Climate Action Plan, which is actually launched last year now, and we've already had one update report. There's a complete chapter devoted to the public sector with a no pressure title of Public Sector Leading by Example. And I encourage everyone to read this chapter if you can't face the whole Climate Action Plan. It's actually not a bad read. There's your lovely illustration of the electric car outside government buildings. So what does it mean? The headline targets is a 30% reduction in emissions, carbon emissions for the public sector by 2030. Every public body to have adopted mandate for climate action in 2019, so that should have already happened, and a 50% improvement in energy efficiency. The difference is energy efficiency is, as I mentioned, measured using energy performance indicators and divide emissions by factors such as full-time equivalent employees or building floor space. So it sort of reflects more the output of than just carbon emissions. There's also some other ambitions actions stated, such as all public buildings to reach the BRB rating before 2030, the widespread adoption of electric road transport, and upgrade of street lighting to LED. Again, read the full annex of actions for full details. So that's what ahead of us as we discuss. As we discussed, it's not going to be an easy task. Just to sum up, I just want to maybe focus on a little bit of how I can make a difference. I've put together a few action points to make a difference in the emergency we're facing. The first thing I'd like to say is that playing part of the Optimising Power Work campaign, you're already making a big difference, as seen in the figures for the campaign earlier. But I want to leave an empowering note, so I thought I'd run through some of my top pointers. This lovely diagram is divided into 3 sections, and each will help move that dial and shift the needle towards greater energy savings and therefore lower emissions and all that entails. The first of the 3 sectors is put under the heading Be a Force for Change, and specifically get involved and engage with others. As part of this, the on-site energy team is something you're already doing. I would say though, seek every opportunity to introduce energy conservation to the conversation and keep it up everyone's agenda as far as possible. Also, I would say don't try to win everyone over, as it's just impossible and can get very disheartening. If you can help one person understand a little, get them on board, and then maybe they will get someone else close to them to act, and so it spreads. Dare I say, like a virus. Probably not the best analogy, but you get the point. Okay, the next sequence refers to the importance of cultural norms, both within the organisation and wider society. Time and again, studies have shown the best way to effective change is let people know that their neighbours are doing and let social pressure do the rest. This is something we'll be revisiting in the 3rd webinar, dedicated to running successful behavioural campaigns. So I would encourage everyone to sign up if they haven't already done so. Fundamentally, lead by example, and the power of people fall in line means change happens. I also think COVID has already shown the power of cultural norms for enabling huge shifts in what would previously be considered beyond the pale are now considered norm, such as working from home. Finally, engage your civil representative. I think we all know that if our politicians or local authority know what topics are important to us as citizens or voters, these subjects get the attention from the top down. Get your engagement going and see where it brings you. The next section is around your ability to influence emissions by your purchasing decisions. So be a conscious consumer. Every watt counts is a mantra for the campaign, and it gets wheeled out a lot, but it is really so important. Small changes multiplied and repeated many times have big effects. It's especially important for electricity, as though although the grid is much more efficient than ever, it still takes about 2 units of production to meet 1 unit of actual demand. So you could say your savings are save one, get one free. The next one is flatten the curve. Now, that's a bit of an emotive term, as you've all heard about COVID, but what do I mean here? We'll just show this slide to demonstrate. And this graph shows electricity demand over a typical Irish winter's weekday, with Ireland on the top and Northern Ireland in that nice beige colour below. These figures from our grid again. As you can see, the peak consumption occurs around 6 p.m. when everyone's home and hungry and all the cooking starts. The higher this peak, the more likely fossil fuels are included in the energy mix, and that figure, carbon intensity we talked about earlier, will increase and move higher. Actually, one of the interesting impacts of COVID crisis has been with more people at home, the peak has actually shifted earlier as the commute is avoided. But if you can consciously reorganize your use of appliances, such as running the dishwasher or washing machine, till either side of this peak, this will help reduce fossil fuels in the energy producing mix and ultimately lower emissions. So that's something you can do. Okay, so the final place is buy smarter. And this obviously just means all your purchases consider the full cost of life analysis. Don't just think of the first price, look at how much it costs to run and buy the most efficient items you can. Apply green procurement principles to all purchases, both at home and at work. Finally, the last section is around making the resources work harder. First, a bit of a plug, but it does need voices. Each webinar will provide excellent guidance and inspiration. Check your diaries after you finished here and fit as many as you can. I promise you won't be disappointed. I'll admit this next one is a bit of a selfish one for me, as I personally like nothing better than energy teams looking for assistance. I often end up learning a bit myself while helping others. Make sure you make use of us and take advantage of our good nature. Finally, and this ties into the previous action point, get your thinking caps on, brainstorm your team over a nice lunch, and let us know what you think would work best for your building or a new angle for the campaign. Give us your feedback, your fresh ideas, and then we can re-energize everyone to make those savings. And with the completion of my wheel, I conclude. Hopefully you found that some interesting and informative, and thanks for your time. I'll now hand back to Paul for any questions that might have come in.
Hi, well, Evan, thank you so much for such an informative presentation. I can see you've done a hell of a lot of research in the 3 areas of your presentation, and you know, some very stark facts, difficult to digest. I think the challenge that we have, it's taken a global pandemic to get an average of 7% carbon reductions globally. And this is the type of reduction we're kind of looking for year on year going forward. It's quite a depressing picture, which kind of, I suppose, leads to a question I have here from Anita, who has asked, how do we stay positive in the face of what is obviously such a big challenge?
Okay, well, I would say that it is difficult. There's some stark facts, and doing some research around the topics here, there is a requirement for movement, but I think if anything has shown us going back to the COVID crisis, it's shown that, as I mentioned, things that were incountenanceable before are now on the agenda. And I think we just need to deal with the climate crisis or emergency in the same way we've dealt with COVID, and give it the attention and the focus it needs. There is solutions out there, and there's simple things we all can do, and there's systematic changes that will make differences. So we just need to focus and get on with it, and taking action is actually very empowering. If you feel you can't do anything, make the small changes that make you feel that you're making your change, and then bring it to others. And it is is a knock-on effect, and it will spread, and we will get there. We have to get there. You know, it's too important.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I think if I could just add, I think you know, we're being encouraged to take individual actions as part of the COVID crisis to protect each other. And I think in the face of the statistics we've just seen there, we can you know, become disillusioned and despondent. But I think somebody once said to me that, you know, don't worry about the things you can't control and worry about the things you can control. And a cornerstone of our programme is for individuals to take small actions. And in the face of the urgency that's required, every little bit you do to stay mindful of energy conservation, every time you switch something off, every time you encourage a little bit of initiative in your workplace or at home to save energy, then you're doing that small little bit. And the summation of all those little initiatives can make a big difference. I have another question here that's slightly unrelated, but I'm going to ask Anita Watts to take it really. It's from Anne-Marie Doyle, who's inquiring how she may access our information portal. And I know we have a session on that, but Anita, could you just respond, please?
Yes, our next session on Thursday is on how to access it and how to look at all the different resources within it. But yeah, Anne-Marie, I have your email address, and I will contact you separately afterwards, and we'll set up your login details. That will also be explained in the session that's happening on Thursday. But I'll get in touch with you and make sure that you have everything set up the way you need it. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
And thanks there also to Barry Phillips, I think, who has also answered that question via text. So thanks for that, Barry. I have a question here about the webinars, if they'll be available to share with colleagues. And the answer to that is yes. Each of the webinars will be recorded and uploaded onto the Optimising Power Work portal, so they can be viewed and reviewed from that access point.
Thank you.
I have another question here, which is what is the BMY for 30% reduction in carbon target for 2030 public sector?
Okay, sorry, just get a question in. What was the?
What is the BMY for 30% reduction in carbon target for 2030 public sector?
Okay. Okay. So BMY. Okay. So I think if that question is about who's responsible for reporting on it, it would be the SEAI is again continuing on their M&R reporting, the reporting system they've got in place, and they will be asking for both 30% energy efficiency improvements, and they'll be looking for that absolute reduction in carbon emissions from 2008 levels, excuse me. So you'll be reporting your M&R figures as previously, and they'll be putting on an extra layer to report the carbon emissions in total. I understand there's actually a document for discussion they're looking for feedback and input on that, how that process is going to work. So if it's something that interests you, by all means get involved, talk to the SEIA, and they will be looking to formulate how that's done in the next few months, I believe.
So Evan, does that mean that the benchmark year for the SEAI benchmark year for various buildings remains the same, does it? Or
yeah, that's what they're talking about at the moment. They haven't actually yet. The carbon emissions nationally from the year set from 2005, but I think they're keeping from when their M&R reporting system stepped in, which I believe is 2009, I believe. Okay,
fantastic. Okay, I've one more question here from Anthony Farrell, who complimented you on your presentation, but he said he's on the EPA carbon reporting. He has a question on this. Who's in charge of monitoring emissions from the public sector? I think you probably answered that as part of the other question, but just to confirm.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it is. It's definitely the SCIA, and the EPA actually reports for the national target, nationally to the European Union, and then SCIA deal with the public sector targets individually. I think that's answered.
Okay, that's fantastic. That's all the text questions that have come in, guys. So I'm just conscious of time. We're a little bit over. If there's no more questions for anyone else, I'll sum up and let people get away. So Evan, thanks very much again for that presentation, and
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your contributions and for registering for the series of webinars. We hope to see you for the other episodes. I've got a slide up there now which just shows the dates and times and subject matter for each. So thanks once again. We'll draw a close to proceedings, and we hope to see you in episode 2 on Thursday, 2nd of July. Okay, thanks very much.